Okay, what does full frame versus crop sensor mean, and why does it matter? So ultimately, it to some degree comes down to what do you want to do. So when you think full frame, or when you hear full frame, just think big sensor. Also think standard sensor, in the sense that usually all of the focal length measurements and comparisons are based off of that sensor size. So think of full frame as something like this, okay? Think of this as full frame sensor, okay? Now think of this as APS-C size sensor. Now think of this as micro four thirds sensor. This is an abstract example, so measurements are not exact. And then think of medium format as this, right? Medium format is bigger than full frame, but it's not a super common sensor size. Usually you're going to be working with, well actually, regardless of whether you're working with the full frame sensor or not, all like the focal length measurements are going to be, as far as I understand, based off of that full frame sensor reference. So what that means is that when you see a lens focal length of 35 millimeters, that's like the full frame equivalent or whatever. Like, what's the best way to say this? Everything is in reference to full frame perspective or field of view or whatever. So like if you have, actually maybe this is the better way to say it, regardless of the actual focal length measurement, everything is in relation to what the full frame equivalent would be. What does that mean? So if you have a micro four thirds sensor like this one I'm filming on right now, that is half the size of a full frame sensor, which means every lens you put on it has a 2 times crop factor. So that measurement, so say I'm filming on a 12 millimeter lens on here, that 12 millimeter is not like a true 12 millimeter field of view on this micro four thirds sensor. It's actually like a 24 millimeter full frame equivalent, because you see everything is like in comparison to what the full frame equivalent is, because that's, I guess, like the standard metric is the full frame equivalent. I guess for whatever historical reasons, maybe that was the more common type of film size to use, or I don't know if that's why, just kind of thinking of things off the top of my head. But if I have a 12 millimeter lens on here, then that's a 24 millimeter full frame equivalent. So in other words, the full frame field of view, like the field of view is basically like what a 12 millimeter on here is what a 24 millimeter would look like on full frame. So like you basically always have to multiply by 2 when working with micro four thirds lenses, because everything is always like in relation to full frame. For whatever reason it is, that's just how it's done. It probably just makes everything more uniform and easier to have everybody understand each other. And so that might be why you see when you see even smaller formats, like sensor sizes that are smaller than micro four thirds, why you might see a lens that's like 9 millimeters, right? Because you might think 9 millimeter, that's like a crazy wide field of view. But if it's on like a 1-inch sensor, I think that's like a 3 times crop factor. So multiply 9 by 3, and that's like the full frame equivalent. I don't know if a 1-inch sensor is exactly a 3 times crop factor, but do you get what I'm saying? 1-inch sensor, smaller than micro four thirds. The smaller everything is than a full frame sensor, the more crop factor, so the higher the multiplication, right? So APS-C, not as much of a crop factor as micro four thirds, right? So micro four thirds has more crop factor than APS-C. So when you put a lens on a micro four thirds camera, the multiplier for the crop factor is higher, right? Because the sensor is smaller. So everything, this all sounds probably very confusing. That's fair enough. What you basically need to understand is that everything, when it comes to lens focal lengths and what the field of view looks like, it's usually always in comparison to what the full frame equivalent would be. Think of full frame equivalent as the full frame version or the full frame look. So for example, like if you wanted like a 20 millimeter field of view on a full frame camera, if you want that same field of view on a micro four thirds camera, you need a 10 millimeter lens because the sensor's smaller, so it's more cropped in. As far as I understand, that's how it works. So hopefully, maybe it'd be good if this was making sense. You know what I mean? Because like it's easy to get when you understand it. And so it might be just literally, if you look up on YouTube examples of like different camera sensor crop factors, it's like that's the best way to kind of see it, or to have it make sense to you, is to literally just see it. So like, you know what I mean? Like if, like, let's pretend this was a full frame camera, and this is like, I had a 30 millimeter lens on here right now, and it looks like that, like what it looks like right now. If I put that same 30 millimeter lens that gives this field of view on a micro four thirds size sensor, so half the size, it's gonna crop in twice as much. So pretend this screen just got smaller, or more zoomed in, I should say. Pretend this got more zoomed in and nothing actually changed with the actual setup of the camera. Everything's in the same place, but all of a sudden it's like punched in twice as much, because that's just how it works. Smaller sensor, more crop factor, more zoomed in. Why does all this matter? So there's other things when it comes to sensor size than just the crop factor of the lenses. There's also things like the low light performance, right? So like full frame sensors typically have some of the best low light performance. In other words, you could crank the ISO higher without getting as much noise. There's other things that might, you know, like you could get into a niche debate about like the look of the image from a full frame sensor versus a smaller sensor. You could get into those kind of more niche arguments, but just for the sake of this, we'll keep to simpler, more definable things maybe. So you got the low light performance. Probably technically the best low light performance is going to be like a medium format, because just think bigger the sensor, the better low light performance. I think this also matters what the megapixel ratio is, because I think the smaller the lesser the megapixel count. So in other words, a 8 megapixel, say you have two sensors exactly the same quality in every way, but one is 24 megapixels and one is 12 megapixels. As far as I understand, the 12 megapixel sensor will have better low light performance. I think I've heard this phrase of like bigger pixels. So essentially the pixels are bigger across the same sensor size. So the bigger the pixel, the more light absorption. I don't know if that's exactly the best way to describe it or accurate or whatever. Feel free to look into that yourself. But there might be something to that. Like that more megapixels doesn't always mean better, especially when we're talking about video here. If you're talking about photos, okay. But if we're talking about video, like you're not, as far as I understand, you're not using the full, like if you have a 48 megapixel camera, unless you're shooting at some ridiculously high resolution, I don't think you're ever using all of those megapixels. It's probably because you have a hybrid camera that could do photo and video, and it's going to use all those megapixels if you have it set to use it during photo mode. But then when you do like video mode, if you're just doing like 4K, you're probably only using like what is, I don't know what I think the exact amount of megapixels needed for 4K is somewhere around 8 megapixels, which might sound like terrible if you're like used to doing like high megapixel photography, because you might think, oh, that's so little resolution. But in terms of what you actually need for a proper 4K video, I don't think you need all that many megapixels compared to what we might think you need. And I think 6K is 12 megapixels. I could be wrong. Like, feel free to look all this up, because I could have my math or numbers wrong here. But like, just keep that in mind. Like different factors, right? And also the age of the sensor could affect this, because if you have an old full frame sensor compared to a really new APS-C sensor, the really new APS-C sensor might actually outperform the old full frame sensor in low light scenarios if you have like the same settings, right? Geared in the same way. Yeah, so there's probably other things I could go over, but I'll probably just end that there. Some of the stuff I might be incorrect about, but hopefully I've gotten something right here. Yeah, another thing is like with crop sensors, because you might think like, why would you ever buy a crop sensor camera? Full frame's just better in all these ways or whatever. Again, it depends on the camera, what the features of the camera are. But another thing is if you do a lot of like telephoto stuff, like if you need to see really far, it might just be an easier option and probably cheaper option to just get like a micro four thirds sensor camera. Because if you want to get a lot of reach, right? If you want to zoom in really far, to zoom in on a rhino in the distance while you're on your African lion safari or whatever, you might want to have like really far zoom. So an easier, or not necessarily easier, but a cheaper way to do that is you have a micro four thirds camera like this, and you put like a 150 millimeter or 300 millimeter lens. It's probably going to be a smaller lens than the full frame version of that lens, or similar version because it's like different manufacturers. But anyway, you know, smaller lens, cheaper lens, but remember the crop factor. So that 300 millimeter lens on here is actually a 600 millimeter full frame equivalent field of view. So you're zooming in twice as far, right, for that focal length because of the smaller sensor. So you get really zoomed in on that rhino on more of a budget, because the 300 millimeter lens for this camera is probably cheaper than the 300 millimeter lens for a full frame camera. Again, it depends on the type of camera and how new the lens is, you know, the manufacturer. All this stuff is going to affect lens pricing, so this is not an exact thing, exact way to talk about it, but maybe I'm making sense. Anyway, I'm going to end that there. Thank you for watching. If you have other questions about cameras and stuff, I'm going to leave my Skool Community link in the description. Feel free to join and ask some questions if you have some questions. Have a good day.